All right, we are live. Welcome back, everyone. I know a lot of folks have been popping in and out, which is so exciting to have folks join us for our Day of Action and Healing. I'm so excited to introduce a very special guest. It's Simran Singh from Sistersong. I am so excited to have you here, Simran, and so excited to have you join us today for such a special event to talk to our supporters and folks across the state and across the country about this work, but particularly from the lens of Sistersong. So thank you so much for joining us. I'll let you introduce yourself, but I just wanted to thank you again for joining us and the very important work that you do. So take it away.
Oh, for sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and to be able to chat with your people and with Planned Parenthood. So thank y'all so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Like Signy said, my name is Simran, and I am the membership coordinator at Sistersong. And for y'all who don't know, Sistersong is the National Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. So we are a Southern-based membership organization, and so the Southern-based is really because we are rooted in Atlanta, we are rooted in Georgia, but we are expanding our work to North Carolina and Kentucky right now. And I think about when we think of ourselves as Southern-based people and Southern-based doing Southern-based work, I think about how places like Pennsylvania are sometimes one bad election, one bad move away from looking a lot like these other states that are much more vulnerable. But it's important for us to recognize that the South has so many communities of color that are being held hostage by conservative governments and conservative policymakers. And so it's really important for us to be focusing on the South and to be collecting in the South and be working with Southern leaders who have been doing this work for so long. So we were created in 1997 by 16 organizations of women of color, and these folks were representing 4 communities. So Native American community, the Indigenous community, the Black community, the Asian American community, and the Latinx community. And so these folks came together with the intention of needing a space to protect the reproductive needs in communities of color, because there were so few spaces that were created for that, and there wasn't really an option, because the mainstream reproductive rights movement was not created for communities of color and was not looking at the needs of communities of color. So that is kind of a little bit about our history, but I'll dive back into it later. And so I think that's something that's really powerful about Sistersong and about the reproductive justice movement in general, is that these 4 groups and 4 communities came together as people of color to fight against white supremacy and to fight against patriarchy as a collective. And so to look at this multi-generational, multi-ethnic group looking to fight towards a common goal. And so I'm just going to say a little bit about me. Like I said, my name's Simran. I grew up in Kennett Pennsylvania, which is about an hour away from Philly. I'm sure some of y'all know it. It's a mushroom capital of the world. And my family is still there, so Kennett Square is home. I lived there from age 6 to age 18. And then after that, I went to Tulane University in New Orleans, where I studied political science and gender and sexuality studies. After college, I worked as a facilitator at an anti-incarceration nonprofit. So I was doing youth justice work, facilitating after-school programming and violence prevention there, and that was based in Syracuse. And now I just started this role. I started this role of membership coordinator in July. I'm really excited to be back at Sistersong because I had the opportunity to intern there in 2019, actually. So if you see the little picture on the screen, I'm on the right, put a little arrow pointing to me. This was during my internship program. So in 2019, Sistersong was suing Governor Brian Kemp in Georgia, for the abortion ban that was going on then. And so that is where that image is from. It was at a rally that we held right before we were announcing that we were suing the governor. So yeah, I had the privilege of interning with Sistersong during undergrad. And on my first day of my internship, it was during this event called the Southern Reproductive Justice Roundtable. And so we host this every year. And basically what we do is get together these Southern groups from all over the South to come together and talk about reproductive rights, talk about reproductive justice, build community, make collaborations, talk about what the work that we're doing is and how we can help each other. And it's a really important Sistersong event. And while I was at that on my first day, I was able to learn the Sistersong definition of reproductive justice, which is, and you can change the slide. So reproductive justice is defined by Sistersong as the right to have children, the right to not have children, the right to raise children in safe and sustainable communities, and the right to bodily autonomy. And a little note about the last one about bodily autonomy is that that one was created actually just a few years ago. So it used to just be the first three as the tenets of reproductive justice, but they added the last one to be more thoughtful to our trans siblings, because Sistersong and reproductive justice, like every movement, has to grapple with its own history. And our history is one that was more focused on cis women in a way that we are actively trying to move away from and have moved away from, and is a very queer movement. But something that we need to think about is, okay, how do we add things that are trans inclusive? And so the right to bodily autonomy is something that was added just a few years back, which is a really exciting addition to the framework and to the theory of reproductive justice. And then if folks in the chat want to throw things out, I'm also going to just kind of break down these 4 categories and talk about things that fall into these categories, because this is really expansive. These 4 categories hit a lot of social justice topics. Pretty much all of them can fit into one of these. And so I would love to go through and just chat about a few that fit into each of these categories. But if folks want to throw anything out, feel free to put that in the chat. But first, for the right to have children, this to me, there are a lot of different ways to take all of these categories. So they are all intersecting. But with the right to have children, I think about things such as access to adoption resources, access to fertility treatments, and having that being covered by insurance, or having access to insurance to have that covered at all. And then also a topic being no forced sterilization, and the eugenics movement being a huge part of American history, and forced sterilization, as Alicia said in the last in the Women's Medical Fund presentation, talking about how forced sterilization is something that happens today regularly and is something that we are not talking about as a reproductive rights issue. So those are kind of things that come to mind for me as a couple of examples of the right to have children. For the right to not have children, this is the one that I think of as the most classic to reproductive rights. So when we think about reproductive rights, we're thinking about abortion and we're thinking about birth control. So those are 2 things that fit under that category. But on top of that, we also have things like transportation that make access possible, because the right to choose means nothing unless you have the access to make your own choices. So transportation to get to whatever clinic you need to get to, the money and funds to be able to access that abortion, whatever it is. And then the next one is about the right to raise children in safe and sustainable communities. So this is about how with reproductive rights, there's a lot of conversation about, okay, a fetus who gets to have birth, who's not having birth, but it comes down to, okay, once these children are born, how can we make sure that they have the happiest and safest lives possible? So this is things like police brutality, making sure that we are living in communities that are safe from any sort of police violence and state violence. This is about environmental racism, the toxins in the water and the air that impact people's fertilities, that impact children's birth outcomes, that impact everybody's health. Having access to health insurance, universal health insurance, having a minimum wage that is livable and that is able to take care of children as well as any other dependents, and be able to live in a happy, not just surviving, but thriving kind of lifestyle. And then the last one, as I mentioned, about bodily autonomy, it was focused on creating trans affirming therapies, but also has a lot of other things that can fall in that category. So, for example, sex work legalization is about bodily autonomy. Having compassionate drug policy is about bodily autonomy. Anti-sexual violence work is about bodily autonomy. So these categories, like I said, they intersect with one another. They are not individualized. They are not little bubbles. They intersect with one another. And I think that that's something that's really powerful about this movement. And as was put in the chat, I do want to plug something that Sistersong has been working on, which is the involuntary sterilization ebook. And so that is at the intersection of the right to have children, so against forced sterilization, but also the incarceration topic, which I believe is under the right to raise children in safe and sustainable communities, breaking down our racist and toxic incarceration system in America. So if you click on that link, basically what happened is that there is a immigration detention facility in Georgia called Irwin, and this is a quote from an LA Times article that at least 19 women at a Georgia immigration facility are now alleging that a doctor performed or pressured them to undergo overly aggressive or medically unnecessary surgery without their consent, including procedures that affect their ability to have children. So this is happening now in real time. Involuntary sterilization is not something of the past. It is something that's happening today, and it's happening to vulnerable populations, specifically incarcerated people and Black and brown people. And so when we found out about this, we put out a statement urging people to have a call to action around this work and to be protecting and supporting trans folks, Black folks, brown folks, indigenous folks, Muslim folks who are in those facilities. And we got over 8,000 signatures, and that was a huge part of the work that was being done around there. And so through Sistersong and other folks who are working on that, all the organizing, there are currently no immigrants detained at Irwin County, and it is set to shut down this year in 2021, which is a really exciting win. It is not the biggest one on the planet because we are still dealing with the fact that they are still detained, and we at Sistersong believe that there should not be folks detained for this reason. But also, it's a huge win that they are no longer in this facility. So this was a really exciting moment for us, and I think really speaks to the intersection for Sistersong about doing the tangible work around closing facilities as well as educational materials. So this involuntary sterilization ebook is an example of those educational materials that go through, and it talks about Irwin County, what was done, the organizing that was done, but it also talks about the history of involuntary sterilization in America. So I'd really recommend checking that out. Okay, so back to my first day at the internship. I was at the Southern Reproductive Justice Roundtable, and I remember looking at those 4 categories, and I turned to the person next to me and I said, wait, so everything is RJ? Like everything falls on these categories, so everything is RJ? And she said, yeah. And I said, well, I feel like that's super overwhelming. And she said, yeah, but isn't it exciting? And that's just a moment that really stuck with me because I feel like that hits the root of reproductive justice for me, is that it has to be about everything. It has to be all inclusive. It really speaks to me in the words of Audre Lorde. You can switch to the next slide. Oh, sorry. These are the involuntary sterilization ebooks. We also have it available in Spanish. Now you can switch to the next slide. Cool. So this one really stuck to me because it really hits home with the words of Audre Lorde. There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. For those who don't know her, Audre Lorde is a Black feminist revolutionary writer and a civil rights activist. And her poetry is really phenomenal and inspiring. So I'd highly recommend reading her stuff. But RJ is expansive and it's all inclusive because it has to be. All of these issues are intersecting. Conversations about abortion would be incomplete and limiting if we didn't talk about white supremacy. Conversations on white supremacy would be incomplete if we didn't talk about environment. It's all connected, and we fail to recognize that those connections are there. We help, and we end up hurting the most vulnerable people in the movement. And so there are things that are like eugenics or like forced sterilization. It feels like it should so obviously be part of the reproductive rights movement. It's about reproduction. And yet it was only impacting vulnerable Black and brown people. It was mostly impacting incarcerated people. And these are people that there's no political incentive to protect. And so the mainstream movement left them behind, which is a huge reason why reproductive justice was created. They needed somewhere that centered vulnerable people because vulnerable people were not being centered by the mainstream movements that were failing to recognize the connections between these intersecting issues. Next slide, please. So this is just a little graphic that looks at all these different issues that fall under the category of reproductive justice. So environmental justice, gender identity, racial justice, ending incarceration, freedom from violence, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought this was cute and really sums it up. These are all reproductive justice issues. So the term reproductive justice was created in 1994, which is 3 years before Sistersong was created. It was right before attending the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo. And so this was an international human rights conference. And basically it was where the world was going to come together and agree that the individual right to plan your own family must be central to global development. This conference was happening in Cairo. And before that, a group of Black women decided to gather in Chicago. And when they gathered, they talked about how the dominant women's rights movement globally and the dominant repro rights movement was totally dominated by white women, by upper to middle class women, and it did not protect women of color. It did not protect poor women, trans folks, indigenous women, etc. And so they ended up coming out of that meeting before the official conference. They came out of this meeting and they named themselves the Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice. And that was the first time that the term reproductive justice was used, which was in 1994. So it is a very recent framework. It was created to be the link between reproductive rights, which is the legality of abortion, and the legality of birth control, and social justice, which is around the ways that privilege and oppression impact our lives. I think what's really important about this is that while it was created as a theory, reproductive justice is not just a theory, it is a practice, which is how Sistersong was created as an opportunity to take that theory and put it into practice. So Sistersong was created 3 years later, and today we are the largest multi-ethnic reproductive justice collective in the world. We do organizing, facilitating, educating, as well as political work and necessary direct service work. So we work for a culture shift, and through that, we provide trainings such as our RJ 101. So if you put the link to the RJ 101 trainings, it's on our website. You can sign up for trainings there. When through that, we are going into organizations that may already be doing movement work. So for example, groups that are doing environmental justice work, but who may not have the reproductive justice framework. So we go in there and we say, okay, let's also look at it from this perspective. And that's an opportunity to connect our movements because, like I said, reproductive justice is all inclusive in that way. We also do narrative shift work. So for that, we do workshops on things like how to talk about abortion for people of faith, people who are in religious communities that may not be having those conversations or that are against reproductive justice. And so we have an opportunity to talk to them about in a way that speaks to faith folks. So we have a faith organizer who's deeply rooted in the faith communities, and they create trainings and have workshops and have conversations with people of faith to talk about how do we talk about or abortion to other people of faith, and how do we combat what the arguments that are really common are. How do we be prepared to have those conversations? So there's a link to a YouTube video, which actually has a conversation with a few folks of faith, one of them being our Sistersong faith organizer, about how to talk to about abortion in faith spaces. And then there's also a link to what is a collective multi-faith prayer that was created by Sistersong as well as a bunch of other faith leaders. And that was created because of the October 2nd organizing. So the women's marches, the abortion justice rallies, talking about what is our collective prayer around it. And that's for whether you're spiritual, whether you're a person of faith or not, whether you're religious or not, is simply about grounding us and about creating some sort of collective wish for the world around us. We've also done things like a queer parenting panel, which is something that we just had. And hopefully we are working to get it on YouTube. So I hope that you all check it out once it is. But we also do political work, like I said, suing the governor and about the abortion ban in 2019, as well as direct service. So things like food drives, fresh food drives, baby drives, things like that. And I, as a membership coordinator, manage the program with our growing reproductive justice network. So we have a membership program that folks can join, and through that, they get access to educational materials, they get discounts to our conferences, events, they're able to support our work, which we obviously deeply appreciate, and be part of our reproductive justice community. So there's a link to join membership in the chat. It's going to go up. So yeah, just being able to be part of our community and stay connected with our work. And so we really are focused on building our membership for Sistersong. Would love to have you join. I will plug that. So now I want to talk about what is the difference between reproductive rights and reproductive justice. So if you want to switch the slide. So this is our Sistersong team. The two words rights and justice are really key here. Rights refers to something that you are entitled to as a citizen or a human being that should be provided for you and protected by the government. So these are reproductive rights, human rights, animal rights. These are things to be provided and protected by the government. The word rights is about laws. Justice is about power structures and breaking down inequities. So when we say reproductive justice, we mean both the legal rights as well as culture shifts and justice in our day-to-day, not just from the government. If you want to switch the slide again. Oh, yeah, switch it again. Thank you. So this graphic talks about just kind of a simplified version of what the difference between the two are. So reproductive rights was started by white middle-class women. It was started by and created for folks that had more privilege. Reproductive justice was started by people of color and low-income folks because they needed a space for this, because the reproductive rights work was so focused on white and middle-class folks that they needed to create something that was for them and that was going to be created to protect them. And that centers the most marginalized. The next is that it is a narrow scope for reproductive rights versus is intersectional for reproductive justice. Reproductive rights focuses on freedom and control of our own reproduction versus reproductive justice is about focus on freedom to control our body and to parent with dignity. So it is just a larger scope of the work. seeks to secure legal rights is about reproductive rights. Seeks to dismantle barriers to access is reproductive justice. Reproductive rights is law focused. Reproductive justice is social justice focused. Reproductive rights is individualistic, and that is about your own pregnancy, your own body. Should you be able to have an abortion? It's about your own individual decisions versus reproductive justice is a collective strategy. It is about how can we protect our communities as a group, as a collective, as a multi-ethnic group. And I think that the main thing is for me is just that reproductive justice is not just about abortion, it's about reproduction in all ways. So sterilization is part of it, birth control is part of it, sexual violence is part of it. These are all about our bodies and how we can take care of our bodies. And so reproductive justice is intended to focus on legality and also focus on everything else. But I think what's so important is that reproductive justice is not in competition with reproductive rights. It is an extension of reproductive rights. It says reproductive rights was not enough for us. We had to build something more. We had to build on top of it, but they're not in competition with one another. So what I see as a few examples are that reproductive rights asks, okay, how can we have IUDs readily available to folks who want it? Reproductive justice asks why when programs that give low-income Black women IUDs for free, but then don't have a follow-up visit, don't have follow-up care, and then leave the IUDs in even when people don't want them in anymore, and that led to infertility. So it's stories like this where it's reproductive rights tells you the first half, which is how do we get IUDs, and then reproductive justice asks larger questions. What about when this impacts low income people and ends up in creating infertility in a large group of women? Reproductive rights asks, how can we get women good quality healthcare? And reproductive justice asks us to examine how the healthcare system routinely harms and kills Black women and actively exploits and tests on low income folks. So it's a yes and. It's a yes and how can we build on that? How can we look at how vulnerable people are impacted by these things that we are talking about? So issues like forced sterilization, eugenics, toxins in the water and air have always impacted Black and Brown communities more, which is why we need a space for Black and Brown communities to be able to talk about these issues, to be able to advocate for these issues, which is where reproductive justice and Sistersong was born. For more information on reproductive justice, you can also go to the Sistersong website, which I will plug at the end. It's on my last slide. And I think the last thing that I want to talk about is really what makes an organization a reproductive justice organization versus a reproductive rights organization. So an example of this will be Sistersong is reproductive justice and Planned Parenthood is reproductive rights, which is not to say that Planned Parenthood is not actively doing reproductive justice work. They are. They're working on access. They're working on breaking down barriers. That is reproductive justice work every single day. But being able to take claim to that reproductive justice label is something that needs to be for folks who are creating a movement that was created by and is for Black and Brown women. And so unfortunately that doesn't meet that criteria, but it doesn't mean that you're not doing that kind of work. And so I think that that's something that's important as we're learning about reproductive justice is how do we not appropriate that movement too? So being able to recognize that it was created for a specific reason. And so only certain folks lay claim to that label, but that the work can be done by anybody. And especially looking at the history of Planned Parenthood, of course, where is a really good example of reproductive rights versus reproductive justice. Margaret Sanger did incredible things for the future of birth control. She was also a eugenicist. And so definitely not reproductive justice framework at the time was very much part of the reproductive rights framework. So that history is a really clear example of when reproductive rights movement failed the vulnerable to protect the white women. And I really want to thank Planned Parenthood leaders today for so actively and unapologetically looking at that history and demanding better. So thank you, Signe. Thank you to all of the Planned Parenthood folks and leaders who I have had the pleasure of interacting with. My last section is about what is your RJ story? What is your reproductive justice story? And so even we do this in all of our trainings, and even if you've never heard the words reproductive justice before, even if this is the first time you're learning about it, everybody has a reproductive justice story. It's just about looking at the ways that your social identities impact your relationship to birth control, to abortion, to family, to the world around you in any way, really. So reproductive rights story, like a hypothetical reproductive rights story might be, okay, I was pregnant, I didn't want to be, I was able to get an abortion. But a reproductive justice story might say, okay, I was pregnant, I didn't want to be, and here's how my identities impacted my ability to get that abortion. Maybe I'm white and wealthy and it was really easy for me. Maybe I'm low income and it was a real challenge to raise the money. It's looking at these intersections. Or maybe it's not about abortion at all. Maybe it's about childcare. Maybe it's about environmental racism, whatever it is. But everyone has a reproductive justice story. And so I challenge y'all as you go home and move on past this day of healing and action to sit down and think about what is your own reproductive justice story? How do your identities impact the way that you experience reproduction and the way that you experience your body in a day to day way? So I will speak a little bit about my reproductive justice story. I grew up in Kennett, Pennsylvania, and the high school and middle school and elementary school that I went to was extremely white. When I started there, it was 98% white, and the 2% was me and my three siblings. We were the 2% of non-white people at our elementary school, and that changed over time, but it was very jarring to move that space. So I grew up entirely around white people, and my family are South Asian immigrants. We're Indian immigrants. And through that, I got very involved. I got very involved in organizing at a young age. And in college, I was very involved in sexual violence organizing. And I still am very passionate about it. But in my spaces in college, I learned how white those spaces were, just how intensely white. And we were doing work around things like bystander intervention. And I was learning that it was proven that bystander intervention didn't work on queer couples, did not work on for queer folks, and that white people would not intervene when it came to people of other racial groups. They were not going to intervene. White women would not protect Black and brown women. They would only protect white women because they couldn't see themselves in those women. And so it was this really jarring moment of, okay, let's look at how are we doing bystander intervention trainings every day when we know that they don't actually protect the vulnerable. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing them, but why is this our main focus? And so I got really caught up in how the sexual violence work that I was doing was focused and prioritizing white people. And so that's kind of how I came to reproductive justice, was realizing, okay, I'm doing work around bodily autonomy, but it is not about my body. And they're not looking at my body as the valued thing in this space and me as a person. And so being able to find out about reproductive justice and realize there's a movement that was created by and for people who look like me was a really powerful thing for me and my organizing moving forward. So, like I said, I challenge all of you to think about what is your reproductive justice story? How do your identities intersect? How are your identities intersecting in a way that maybe cannot be represented by the movements that you have been part of before or the movements that you hope to be part of in the future? Yeah, that is all I have. I want to say thank you so much to Planned Parenthood and everyone for inviting me here. I'm so excited to be here. You can switch the slide. There is a Oh, I was bad on these slides. I'm sorry. There's a thank you. Feel free to email me, reach out to me anytime, join membership, donate, do all the things. But I would love to stay connected with y'all. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh my gosh, Lemon, thank you so much for such a great presentation. I know our staff and supporters are always having conversations about using an RJ lens in the work, right? While we're not an RJ organization, we should use the lens and credit that to folks like you that do the work every single day, because this movement will be much stronger if we do that. So, thank you so much for joining us and speaking to our supporters and all the folks tuning in. This was so great. I feel like I also learned lots. I feel like we do this work all the time, but it's always so refreshing to work with new folks, dope folks, and to learn something new. So appreciate you so, so much. And thank you again.
Thank you. I so appreciate being here.